Hi, I'm Tim Phillips at Phillips and Company Advisors. Everything we do is built around one idea, helping you build not just wealth, but confidence, clarity, and long-term financial strength. Because the truth is, success with money isn't about spreadsheets alone. It's about behavior, patience, and perspective. That's why I'm excited to introduce our friend Morgan Housel, best-selling author of Psychology of Money. Morgan is one of the most thoughtful voices in finance. He brings stories, history, and human behavior together in a way that makes complicated ideas simple and powerful. Morgan, thanks for being here and take it away.
Hey everyone, I'm Morgan Housel. Thank you again to Tim and everyone else at Phillips and Company for having me and letting me do this. And what I want to talk about today is the idea that risk is what you don't see, and that we can spend our days planning about our finances and our goals for retirement, whatever it might be, planning the risks in front of us, and that's a good thing. You should do that. But when you're done with that exercise, the biggest risk in your life is what you're not planning for. Many years ago, I came across this video that I thought was so haunting. It kind of stopped me in my tracks. It was a video of a newscast from the morning of September 11th, 2001 in New York City. And the newscasts were from about 8 in the morning, which is an important time for this story. And the newscast says, "Good morning. It's Tuesday, September 11th, 2001 in New York City. It's going to be a beautiful afternoon, high about 80 degrees, a wonderful day in front of us." Now that coming at 8 in the morning, of course, had no idea what was about to happen in the city 30 minutes or so later. That idea that the biggest risk is invisible to us, that's an extreme example, but that happens very often when we are thinking about the risks that sit in front of us, that the biggest risk that's going to do the most damage is what is not in the newspaper, what is not on the news, what nobody's talking about, and what nobody is planning for. Let me tell you another little story about this that I've always thought was pretty informative. Before NASA went into space in rockets, which were very expensive and very dangerous back in the 1950s and 60s, they tested a lot of their theories and their equipment in these ultra-high altitude hot air balloons. So NASA had these hot air balloons that could go up to like 150,000 feet of altitude, very high, like basically into space, to cheaply and more safely test a lot of their theories about astrophysics. And one of those test flights took place in July of 1960, when a NASA test pilot, his name was Victor Prather, took one of the hot air balloons up to test NASA's new spacesuit. Took the balloon up to about 115,000 feet of altitude to test the suit, and the suit worked perfectly. And he starts descending back down to Earth. Now, one of the quirks of the suit that he was wearing during this flight, this new spacesuit that NASA had, is that unlike the moon suits that came a little bit later that were climate controlled, this suit that Victor Prather was wearing was basically a metal and rubber onesie. It was very hot and very stuffy to wear, especially in a hot air balloon coming back down to Earth in the July summer heat. And so when Victor Prather was low enough in altitude to breathe on his own, at about 5,000 feet, he opened up the faceplate of his helmet to catch some fresh air. Now, he's low enough to breathe the oxygen in the atmosphere. He knows what he's doing. It's not that big a deal. Now, plan A was that he would land on the back of an aircraft carrier that was awaiting him in the ocean. But a very well-known plan B was that he would land in the ocean. The hot air balloons were hard to steer, they got bucked around in the wind. Everyone knew, ideally you land on the back of the aircraft carrier. Good chance you're going to end up in the ocean. Not that big a deal. They had a plan for that. And so that's what happens. Victor Prather is coming back down to Earth, and he lands in the ocean. Now, in that scenario, what NASA was going to do in this plan B was hover over him in a helicopter, drop down a safety line that he would attach to himself and be pulled to safety. As he's doing that, as Victor Prather is trying to attach himself to the safety line, he slips and he falls into the ocean. Now that too was not supposed to be that big a deal because the suit that he was wearing, this spacesuit, was supposed to be watertight and buoyant. And so nobody in the rescue mission is freaking out when he falls into the ocean. They're moving on to plan C, which is that a Navy SEAL would jump into the water and help him out. But since he had opened up the faceplate to his helmet, all of a sudden his suit was not watertight and it was not buoyant. And as soon as he hit the ocean water, his suit filled up with water and he sunk like a rock and drowned. Now, 4 astronauts died in the pursuit to get to the moon. All of them died on Earth, which is an interesting little tidbit, I think, in this space race. Victor Prather was the first one of them. But here's what's really important in this story. NASA is the most planning-centric organization that has ever existed. You don't go to the moon by crossing your fingers and hoping for the best and hope that risk doesn't get in the way. That just doesn't work. Every conceivable risk for every NASA mission, including these test flights, they had binders filled with every risk that they could imagine and plan A, B, and C for how to mitigate those risks. Everything that could possibly go wrong that they could think of, they thought about. And in their post-mortem of what happened to Victor Prather, NASA basically said, look, we thought of every imaginable risk of what could happen to him during this mission, except the one thing that nobody ever thought about, which was what happens if this poor guy wants to catch a little fresh air and open up the vent on his helmet. And that idea that you can sit around and plan for risks all day, and you should do that, but what is left over is what's not on that list is very important. Carl Richards, who's a great financial advisor, he has a saying that I love. He says, risk is what is left over when you think you've thought of everything. It's so good. Risk is what's over when you think you've thought of everything. And I think that plays such a big role in the global economy. Several newspapers and magazines every January put together and publish a forecast of what they think is going to happen in the year ahead. So the Wall Street Journal does this, The Economist does this. They say, hey, it's January 1st. Here's what to expect in the global economy over the next 12 months. And the best journalists, the best analysts come together and they predict what's going to happen over the next 12 months. Very interesting to go back in hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, to see how these did. And I would challenge you to go back and do some of these. They are astounding because every single year, including this year, as I'll say in a second, that you go back and read what people were forecasting was going to be the biggest economic risk of that year, in hindsight, was not the biggest economic risk of the year. If you go back to just a couple months ago, 60 days ago, at the beginning of 2026, how many of those magazines said that the biggest economic risk of the year, at least so far, has been the war in Iran and closing of the Strait of Hormuz, and that oil prices would increase by 50%? Zero. None of them were mentioning things like this. They would mention other risks that were very big risks, that were something that you should be worrying about. But to date, so far, there's a lot of the year left, the biggest risk is what they didn't see coming. And this is true in any given year. In any given year, in any given time period, what looked like the biggest risk with foresight was not the biggest risk with hindsight. Especially, I would say, the truly big events that shape history. Pearl Harbor, 9/11, COVID, of course. The common denominator of those events is not just that they were big, it's that they were unforeseen until the moment that they arrived. There's a lot of humility in saying that's just my baseline expectation. But in a world where the biggest events are unforeseen, I think it's a much smarter way to think about risk. Now, also, I think there's something to be said about the difference between getting rich and staying rich. They are two very different skills. Getting rich requires being an optimist, taking a risk, swinging for the fences. That's what you need to get rich. Staying rich is almost the exact opposite skill, polar opposite skill. It requires a degree of pessimism and conservatism and understanding how fragile and how unforeseeable some of the risks in the world are. And I think getting those two skills to marry, to coexist at the same time, very optimistic on one hand, very pessimistic on the other at the same time, is very important to do well financially. One way that I've thought about this is that I want to save my money like a pessimist, and I want to invest my money like an optimist. I want to save money with the idea that the world is very fragile and that the biggest risk this year, next decade are unknown. I don't know what it's going to be. You don't know what it's going to be. Nobody does. What makes it risky is that it's unforeseen. Accept that reality, and I want to invest my money like an optimist. with the idea that if I can endure and put up with all of those unknowns in front of me, that the rewards for those who stick around will be spectacular. And so that's how I try to make sense of a world that is filled with unknowns. It's a humbling thing to think about, but I think it's a very realistic way to think about. And so rather than trying to forecast what's going to happen next in the economy, with geopolitics, with AI, whatever it might be, trying to make myself more durable to endure the widest range of outcomes that could possibly hit me, or at least that I can fathom, and then with the confidence that the rewards for those who can stick around will be fantastic.